On today's show, I am breaking down all of the Rangers' starting pitching free agent options. There are so many choices, putting them in a tiers list, what's likely, what's possible, and what is the wonderful pipe dream that might end up making this offseason look a little bit like last offseason. All that and more on this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked onto the Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Rangers fan since 2010, the founders and host for all 4 seasons of this Locked On Rangers podcast. Today is Tuesday, November 8th, and we are officially in the offseason, waiting to see what the heck these Rangers are going to do. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. If you're not already, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick. You can follow the show at Locked On Rangers and subscribe on YouTube, where the best way you can help grow the show is to comment any single thing below. Now, on today's show, we are breaking down a big picture look. All this week is going to be a free agency preview, looking at different positions, who should be top of their list, bottom of their list, middle of their list, and what do the Rangers even need to do. Let's start off by naming the Rangers' biggest needs. I think number 1, it's a starting pitcher. Number 2, it's a starting pitcher. Number 3, maybe middle of the order bat. And number 4 is yet another starting pitcher. The team payroll right now is sitting at $92 million. I think there's space to add conservatively $60 to $70 million if they want to go absolutely ham and just go nuts on the quite a few very good starting pitchers that are on the market. I think there's a possibility at the highest end. I mean, the highest end, adding $100 million. So I have 4 tiers for these different starting pitchers. I do have a 1A and a 1B, but for the most part, it is just 4 tiers of starting pitchers, and there are a lot of options. The great news, even though the Rangers have to add a whole lot, I think there are a whole lot of options, so that even if some of their, top tier, highest priority guys end up not going to Texas or signing somewhere else, then they can make some deals with some quality middle of the rotation pitchers, which is what the Rangers need. They do need a top end guy, but they also need just some depth, because injuries happen all the time to pitchers, and the Rangers, as they showed last year, didn't have a whole lot of depth going into the season, and I still think they needed to add one more starting pitcher going in. That ended up definitely being the case last year. Whoever was there stepped up and did a fine enough job, but it was not a rotation that was going to land the Rangers in the playoffs, and the mandate from up high has been, you got to make the playoffs next year. So part of that is spending money. Another part of it is spending it wisely, and I think there are a lot of wise options. Now, let's get to tier 1A. I qualify this as the short-term kind of pipe dream, top of the rotation guy. I don't think any of these are particularly likely. One is a little more likely than the other ones, but all of these are absolutely possible, just not necessarily the most likely. The top of this group obviously is Jacob deGrom. He has opted out of his player option. He's going to be a free agent. He has been with the Mets. He has had some injury issues, but when he's been healthy, he's been absolutely fantastic. Last year, or 2021, 2022, whatever year this is, he pitched 64 and a third innings. He is going to be 35 next year. A 3.08 ERA, 102 strikeouts, 1.2 baseball reference WAR. He has won the Cy Young twice. He is a 4-time All-Star. The market value, all these market valuations are from our friends at SpotTrack, or acquaintances. They don't know who I am, so just the website SpotTrack. And the likely deals are just things that I have projected. So I'm going to be going through a lot of these for these different guys. Market value for deGrom is at $41.88 million average annual value. I'm projecting his deal to be somewhere in the 3 years, $125 million range. We just saw a kind of short-term deal for Max Scherzer that was 3 years, $130 million with the same Mets team. I think the Mets, who have said they're not going to go for Aaron Judge, I don't know if that's necessarily true, but deGrom is obviously their top guy, and if they let him walk, ownership, who is the richest ownership group in all of Major League Baseball, is absolutely never going to hear the end of it. Next guy in this short-term pipe dream kind of tier is Justin Verlander, who's going to be 40 years old next year, coming off an absolutely fantastic season after not pitching in 2 years. Just absolutely incredible, him defying father time. 175 innings pitched this year, 1.75 ERA, 185 strikeouts, 5.9 baseball reference WAR, 2-time Cy Young Award winner and MVP, a 9-time All-Star. Now, the market value for him is just a little bit below where it is for deGrom, $41.75 million average annual value. I'm projecting his likely deal, he might be getting a little bit more than that. 2 years, $84 million. That'd be a $42 million average annual value. And the third one in this short-term kind of tier is Clayton Kershaw, who is going to be 35 next year. Coming off a year where he pitched 126 and a third innings, a 2.28 ERA, 137 strikeouts, 3.8 baseball reference WAR. He's got 3 Cy Youngs, an MVP, a 9-time All-Star, and has had a few injuries the past few years, hasn't been as healthy as he had been earlier in his career, hasn't pitched 150 innings since 2019, but still, when he is on the mound, he is absolutely as dominant as he's ever been. The market value for him is at $31.31 million average annual value. I'm projecting his likely deal 2 years, $60 million. Maybe it's 1 year, $25 million. Last year he signed, I think the average annual value market for Spot Track had him at around $25 million this year. Last year, he signed a $17.3 million deal. He could sign something in that range. He's kind of a wild card to predict. I think, in all likelihood, he probably goes back to the Dodgers. But like last year, I think it's a 2-horse race whenever he's deciding, in my own personal opinion, not that I'm good friends with Clayton and having any insight into his mind, I'm thinking that towards the end of his career, he might want to come home and pitch for a year or two in Dallas for his hometown Texas Rangers team. But it's going to be really hard to not go back to the Dodgers coming off that, 115 win season. It's really hard to turn that down, even if he could help break the playoff drought for his hometown team. Coming up, we're going to look at some of the long-term top of the rotation options, some tier 2, tier 3, and eventually the, I guess, if you had to force me, and reclamation projects that the Rangers could get on at the right time. But first, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. You can get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball to soccer to esports, we've got it all on betonline.net. The college basketball season has started. There were, I believe, approximately 18 million games played yesterday. I don't know, that's just a light ballpark estimate, but pretty much everyone started playing yesterday. I believe men's and women's both started playing. NBA had 15 games. There's a lot of sports going on. Even though the baseball season is over, you might want to look at some futures for the Rangers if you're feeling pretty bullish on what the Rangers are going to do this offseason, or, whatever else your little heart desires to bet on. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more, because BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Now, this Tier 1B, which I don't know, it's necessarily lesser. Usually you hear Tier 1A, 1B. 1B is usually the lesser one. It's not really. It kind of is, but I think one of the highest paid pitcher in terms of total money will come from this group. This is Tier 1B, the long-term top of the rotation pitchers. Now, there are only 2 players in this group, and number 1 is Carlos Rodon, who is going to be 30 years old next year, coming off 178 innings pitched this year. Was healthy, did not miss a start. They shut him down for 1 start at the end of the season because San Francisco was out of the playoffs, but he has opted out and become a free agent. Had a 2.88 ERA this year, 237 strikeouts, a 5.4 baseball reference WAR. He is a two-time All-Star, somehow is not in the top 3 finalists for NL Cy Young that were just announced. I don't really know how, because he was absolutely phenomenal this year and is by far my top choice for the Rangers to go and sign. Right now, his market is listed at $31.64 million average annual value. I'm saying his likely deal. I think he wants a big long-term deal. He just took a 1-1 deal to kind of prove himself. He had a great start to 2021, made his first All-Star team, but only ended up pitching 132 and 2/3 innings. Injuries have been his big bugaboo. Basically, since college, when he was the number 3 overall pick, he got thrown way too often by his NC State coach, and it has led to some injuries. He only pitched over 150 innings before this year one time, and that was back in 2016 as a 23-year-old, and he had a 4.04 ERA when he did it then. This year did 178 innings, which was a career high, and a career low for pitching over 150 innings. The year before had a 2.37 ERA and 132 and 2/3 innings. So he's basically had 2 really, really fantastic years, looking like the guy he always knew that he could be, and some prospect evaluators always thought that he had in him. According to Baseball Reference projections for next year, a 3.06 ERA, 162 innings, and 199 strikeouts. That sounds like a top of the rotation pitcher, a guy that you want as your frontline ace going into a playoff game. I think dishing out a 5-year deal for him is obviously risky. He's had those injuries for the past few years, but he stayed healthy this year. He showed how great he can be last year, and I think that if the Rangers want to take a big gamble and throw a crap ton of money at somebody, obviously there's the deGrom injury factor, there is the Kershaw injury factor, and same with Justin Verlander. All these top tier guys, I'm putting all 4 of these in the could frontline a playoff rotation as a game 1 starter. You got to have one of them. I think you've got to have one of these 4 guys, and if the Rangers are going to make a significant long-term investment, more than 2 years on any of these guys, I think Rodon is probably the guy. He is the youngest by far. He's going to be 30 next year. deGrom's 35 next year. Clayton Kershaw is going to be 35 next year, and Verlander's going to be 40. I feel much safer in this investment, even if the back end does end up looking like not a great deal. He is not able to last all 5 years and be a top rotation pitcher. I think that it's definitely worth the investment. Number 2 in this category is Martin Perez. And I know what you're saying. Oh, well, Martin Perez is not nearly as good as Carlos Rodon. Well, they were on a pretty similar plane this year. Martin Perez can be 32 next year, pitched more innings than him, 196 and a third innings, a 2.89 ERA, literally within 0.01 of Carlos Rodon. Doesn't strike out nearly as many batters, but had a 5.0 Baseball Reference for, just 0.4 below what Rodon did. He has half as many All-Star appearances as Rodon, a one-time All-Star appearance, and he's probably going to be in the top 10 of Cy Young voting this year, if not the top 5 in the AL, while Rodon is probably going to be in the top 5 of NL Cy Young voting. The market value, there's nothing listed on Spotrac for Martin Perez, which I find kind of questionable. I think it's a hard market to predict. I think that the Rangers, whatever the market for a random other team would be, maybe that would be around 18 million, but I think the Rangers can definitely get it done with 15 million. I know that this is just a 1 year of Martin Perez being fantastic, and last year he found his way out of a pretty mediocre Boston Red Sox rotation and in the bullpen. But I think this is a legitimately different pitcher. The Rangers love him. He loves being in Texas. Get this deal done right freaking now. I say a likely deal would be 4 years, $60 million, maybe even 3 years, $45 million gets it done. But whatever it takes, bring this guy back. The Rangers need him towards the top of their rotation. If you have a 1-2 of Rodon and Perez and John Gray is your number 3, that's a really darn good rotation. And I think the Rangers could absolutely use both of these guys and need, like I said, multiple arms. Let's get into tier 2, the pretty good category. This category includes such greats as Chris Bassitt, who's going to be 34 next year, pitched over 180 innings with an ERA under 3.5, 3.2 Baseball Reference WAR, has made 1 All-Star appearance. Market value is 20.87 average annual value. I don't know that he's going to get that much, but my likely deal is 3 years, $63 million. If the Rangers, for some reason, let Perez get away, I think having Chris Bassitt as your number 2 in your rotation. I think he and John Gray would be kind of on a similar plane. That's kind of how I view both of them. But Bassitt is going to be 34 next year, so he is, I think, probably the best in this category of tier 2, but I think he'll also probably be the most expensive. Another guy in this tier is Taijuan Walker, who's going to be 30 next year, pitched over 150 innings, ERA under 3.5, 2.6 BWAR, market value $13.87 million. I think he's going to get somewhere in a 3-year deal. He was really darn good for the Mets this year. They bought low on him, and he performed pretty darn well. Somewhere around $3 million, or 3 years, $45 million. That'd be $15 a year. I think that would be a deal to get it done. He'd be a guy who I would really like for the Rangers to get. Maybe if he was the second best starting pitcher they signed this offseason, and they get one of those 1A or Carlos Rodon types in their rotation, then that could be a pretty decent second guy to get in there. Another guy on the market, a lefty, Tyler Anderson, who is going to be 33 next year, had a really fantastic season with the Dodgers. Hasn't done a whole lot, but we're going to get into a little bit more of what he did do and why I think he could be a really, really good pickup for the Rangers at maybe a bit of a bargain. Right after this word from our sponsors. So Anderson had the best year by far of his career, one of 2 different lefties who had fantastic years. For the Dodgers, he had more success than his counterpart, who will be coming up later on in the show, but 178 and 2/3 innings and a 2.57 ERA, a 4.3 baseball reference WAR, and made his first All-Star appearance this season. Absolutely phenomenal year. The market is listed at $13.64 million average annual value. I think he's probably going to get more than that. He was really darn good this year. It just kind of depends on how much you think it is just the Dodgers and their pitching whispering, fixing him, because he only pitched in, he did miss a couple of starts, but not that many. He was pretty darn healthy this year. He split time between Seattle and Pittsburgh in 2021 and, did throw over 160 innings. He's been pretty durable for the most part. Pitched just under 60 innings in 2020, missed a decent chunk of time in 2019, but pitched 176 innings, which was his career high before this year in 2018 with Colorado. So I think this could be a really, really good pickup for the Rangers. He might be a guy who, he pitched like a top of the rotation pitcher this year. I don't know how much I buy it as much as I buy what Carlos Rodon and Martin Perez have done. I just didn't see a whole lot of Anderson this year, but I think could be a really, really good steal for the Rangers. Next guy on this tier 2 list, Jose Quintana, had a fantastic year between Pittsburgh and St. Louis. Literally one of the very few bright spots for the Pirates this year. Was excellent down the stretch with the Cardinals to help them get into the postseason. Going to be 34 next year. Pitched 165 innings, ERA under 3, 3.4 BWAR. No market value listed for him. I think that somewhere in the 2 years, $30 million range could be what he makes next year. I think he made around something like $4 million. Not a whole lot of money this year to be pretty darn good. He had been on the downswing for quite a while. Jose Quintana made $2 million this year. He had shown he could be a top end of the rotation pitcher, but things had just really not gone his way the last few years. Really got things right in Pittsburgh. They were able to flip him for some value to St. Louis at the deadline, but a guy who is definitely worth checking out and I think could be a really nice addition to this Rangers rotation. Last guy in this tier 2 list, Jameson Taillon, going to be 31 next year. Over 175 innings for the Yankees last year. ERA under 4, 151 Ks, 1.3 BWAR, market value $14.6 million. Average, I don't know if he's necessarily going to get that, but maybe someone gets desperate. I think he might be one of the guys who sticks around in the market long after some of these top tier guys are gone and gets a lot more money that way. Something in the range of a 3-year deal I think makes sense for him because he's been pretty healthy and been around average-ish the last couple of years in New York and helped them get to the playoffs. So maybe he gets something in the 3-year $44 million range. Now, tier 3 is the fine. You probably need one of these guys in your rotation if you get Martin Perez and Rodon. maybe you might have to settle for someone in the tier 4, which is the short-term kind of reclamation project. But these are kind of the guys the Rangers have had a lot of success with. Think of the Lance Lynn, Mike Minor, Kyle Gibson deals. This is kind of where they hit their sweet spot. So I think one of these guys might be someone that they could really remake and have one of those really, really good seasons. There are quite a few options. Andrew Heaney is the other one of those Dodgers pitchers who came in and had a fantastic season, had bounced around a couple different places, been with the Angels for a while, was not great when he went to the Yankees, but this year he did have some shoulder injuries, which are a bit of a concern. He's going to be 32 next year. Just had 72 and 2/3 innings pitch, but 110 strikeouts and a 3.10 ERA, a .7 baseball reference WAR. The market value for him is listed at $11.64 million. I'd say he gets something right around that, 3 years, $35 million. That would be almost right on the money of what the market value is. He is going to be 32 next year, so he does still have quite a few more years of prime. Maybe only gets a 2-year deal, but someone who I think the Rangers should keep an eye on. Next guy on this list is Noah Syndergaard. We all know about Noah Syndergaard and what he has done the last couple of years, and it's been a huge bummer to watch what happened to him this year. He only pitched 134 and 2/3 innings, coming back from Tommy John surgery. He only pitched in 2 games or 2 innings for the Mets in 2021, but he was not signed back with the Mets, got a pretty big 1-year deal with the Angels. They flipped him at the deadline to Philadelphia, and he just never regained his velocity, like not even really anywhere close. It kind of got a little bit closer towards the end of the season, in the postseason specifically, in some of those shorter starts, but he pretty much lost his spot in the rotation at the end of the season with Philadelphia, and their rotation wasn't exactly super deep. So if the Rangers think that maybe in the second full year after him having Tommy John surgery, he can find some velo, or they can kind of fix him and teach him how to pitch better when he doesn't have some of the most elite sinker velo that anybody had, like he had when he was in his prime, maybe he might be worth a little bit of a look. The market is at $15.29 million. I don't really know that he gets that, especially not for a multi-year deal. I think something in the range of 2 years, $28 million, where he's getting $14 million a year would be fine. I mean, he's not bad. He had an ERA under 4 for the season, 134 innings, but not the top end Thor that you were expecting. Plus, he's a Mansfield kid. If you wanted to bring him home, that would be a nice, fun thing to do. Another guy, Michael Wacha, 31, had a pretty good year with Boston. Market value is just under $12 million for him. 127 innings, not a whole lot of innings for him, but a 3.3 baseball reference WAR this season for him. Pretty valuable when he was on the mound, but again, not a whole lot of innings. I think he might end up getting somewhere in a 3-year, $36 million range. It's kind of hard to predict. The market, I didn't watch him a whole lot, so I'm not exactly sure how his BWAR is so much higher than I would kind of expect for a guy who pitched 127 innings. Sean Manaea is another guy who I think I might end up putting him in the tier 4. Yeah, I think I'm going to move him to the tier 4. Another guy from Boston, Nathan Eovaldi, has had some pretty good seasons. Even 2021 was a fantastic season for him. This year, not so much. An ERA at 3.87, 109 innings pitched. Market value is at 16.73 for him. I don't really know how much I buy that. He's only had one really, really great season. That was in 2021. He's going to be 33 next year. I don't know, maybe 2 years, $28 million to get him, but I don't see him making $16.7 million that he's projected as for Spot Track. Carlos Carrasco is a guy who's a little bit older, had 150 innings and a sub-4 ERA this season. Fine, number 3-4 starter, would give you some depth. Something in the 2 years, $20 million range, I think, could get him. Zach Eflin is a bit of a question mark. He was a decent prospect coming up from San Diego. Didn't have the greatest season with the Phillies this year. Ended up moving to the bullpen. Had just 75 and 2/3 innings pitched. He's going to be 29 next year, so he is still pretty young. A 4.04 ERA, and he is listed at the market value of $13.79 million. seems a bit much. Maybe 2 years, 25 mil would be able to snag him, and he could kind of fill out some depth in that rotation. Now, let's look at the short-term reclamation project. There are a few familiar faces. Actually, I guess just one familiar face in Kyle Gibson. I did look at Mike Minor, and just I think a six plus ERA with Cincinnati this year. Don't know that I would want to take a look at him, but Kyle Gibson would probably be towards the upper end of my list. He would be a number 4 or 5 starter, kind of be around on par with Dane Dunning in the expectations, but I think the depth that you're going to get out of him, I think would be very, very valuable this year. This upcoming year is going to be 35, had over 165 innings pitched, an ERA just north of 5, not exactly ideal, was an all-star with the Rangers. I think something in like the 1 year, $6 or $7 million range could definitely get him. Would not be at the top end of my list, but I think a good familiar face. He really liked his time with the Rangers liked him. There could be some good feelings there. Mike Clevenger, another short-term reclamation project, none of these guys actually have a market value according to SpotTrack. So really the deal is anyone's guess. Clevenger was with San Diego this year and kind of fell off a freaking cliff. Before that, he had been with the Cleveland Guardians and was really darn good. As recently as 2020, he was one of the Padres' best starters. This year was not great, a 4.33 ERA, a .6 baseball reference WAR in 114 innings, and maybe something in the 1 year, $8.5 million, because he's still relatively not old. He's 32 next year, so not old. James Paxton is another huge reclamation project. Would be if you're adding 4 starting pitchers, then that's when I would add James Paxton. But I think it could be worth a look. Last year, he only pitched in an inning and a third. He's going to be 33 next year at a 6.75 ERA. Has missed a lot of time recently, but had some stuff in there. When he was healthy, he was pretty darn effective for the Mariners, but the last few years has just really not been able to stay healthy. Maybe a 1 year, $4 million deal could get it done. And one of the older guys on here, Wade Miley. Actually, a lot of these guys end up being left-handed. Wade Miley is going to be 36 next year. Didn't pitch a whole lot for the Cubs this past year, but the Reds pretty much just gave him up for literally no reason after having a pretty darn good year with Cincinnati in 2021. He had a 3.37 ERA that year in 163 innings. This year, he only pitched in 9 games. 8 of those were starts, 37 innings, and a 3.16 ERA for the Cubs. He's going to be a free agent. So maybe something in the 1 year, $8 million range. He probably would make a little bit more than Kyle Gibson, maybe a little bit less than Mike Clevenger because he is a little bit older, but has had some pretty darn good seasons as of late and could provide some pretty darn good depth. He's had a couple of injury-shortened seasons, including last year, 2021. He only pitched in 6 games total for Cincinnati, but did pitch 167 in 2019 with Houston. Kind of forgot that he was there in Houston in 2019, but would be a nice guy to look at. And one more of the reclamation project, Sean Manaea had just a pretty darn terrible year for the San Diego Padres this year. He is going to be 31 next year. He pitched 158 innings with a 4.96 ERA, lost his spot in the rotation, was just kind of asked to be a mop-up guy / tandem starter in the playoffs for San Diego, and that really didn't end up going super well for him. In the NLCS, where the Phillies knocked him out, he didn't have nearly as bad a time as Clevenger, but still not exactly what they thought they were getting when they traded for him from the A's. I think it could get a pretty long-term deal because he is so young, but he had a negative 0.9 baseball reference for this year. His market value is listed as just, $20,000 below $12 million. So I think he could end up with something in the 3 years, $30 million range. That's $11 million a year. If the Rangers are feeling like they could fix whatever his problem was, didn't have a whole lot of super great success before that. He had just a lot of, fine seasons. For his career, he has a 4.06 ERA in 885 innings, about 8 strikeouts per 9. Doesn't walk a whole lot, just 2.3 per 9. Just fine. Number 4-ish starter. Give some depth to the rotation. Maybe you want to sign him on a 1-year deal if you think you can bounce him back, or maybe a 2-year deal. Maybe 3 years is just a bit too much, but he is still pretty young, so I think that he could provide just a little bit of depth, and if they do end up pushing him to the bullpen, I think he's got the stuff that could do pretty well in there. So those are all of my starting pitchers that I think are going to be likely options. There are a few more guys on the market, but I didn't think anybody else that was really worth spending a whole lot of time on this. Now, just overall, this is my ideal but possible scenario. Just can go through this real quick of starting pitchers added. Again, I think they need 3. I think one of them needs to be a top end of the rotation pitcher, and I would very much like for the number 2 guy to be Martin Perez. So this is my ideal but possible. Carlos Rodon, sign him 5 years, $150 million. Martin Perez, sign him 4 years, $60 million. And then for that depth starter, you add in Kyle Gibson at 1 year, $7 million. Payroll after that would be 144 mil, which would be just behind the White Sox and above the Phillies, but it would be $20 million below last year's payroll. That'd be, I think, $51 million added at that point for just next year would leave somewhere between 9 and 19 million to go sign a hitter and or whatever bullpen help you would need, and $217 million total added, which is still significantly less than last year, but a good bump. Mostly in the short term. I think, 5 years is the longest term contract that I added there. So none of these decade-long deals. But in my ideal dream scenario where everything goes right and it's kind of like last year, my dream would be basically the same thing, except you switch out Kyle Gibson for Clayton Kershaw on a 1 year, $25 million deal. That would add $70 million to the payroll at $162 million, which would be right around what the Rangers paid last year. Last year, they also had quite a few contracts that were that they ended up burying or retaining, basically paying other players to be on other teams. I don't think they have any of that on their books for this upcoming year. So they should have some room to spend quite a bit of money. At this point, I don't think they have any buried money. Yeah, at least according to Spot Track, they don't have any buried money or retained money or suspend money. So they've got a lot of money to add. I think if they're in the top 10 in payroll, I think that should be enough to get them pretty competitive. Like I said, with them adding all this much, people are going to, for some reason, make fun of a team for spending. But they have a lot of room to add, especially for how big a market this is and for how hungry this ownership group is for a playoff team. I think if they're truly committed to it, then they could definitely add one of these Rodon and Perez. And then, honestly, whatever else happens, as long as they add, I think, one more starting pitcher, it doesn't really matter. As long as it's almost any of these guys in that tier 4, if you could add both of those guys in the long-term starting pitcher, the Rodon, Perez, and then someone in the tier 2 of the Quintana, Tyone, Anderson, or Walker or Bassitt range, that would be just phenomenal. I don't think that's likely. I don't think that's what you should expect, but I have been very wrong before on some of these free agent predictions because it seems like this ownership is about to put their money and their checkbook where their mouth is, and their mouth is writing checks that their checkbook can cash, I'm hoping. But that's going to do it for today's episode. On tomorrow's show, I'm going to be looking at some of the hitters, doing a kind of similar episode. There are obviously a lot fewer hitters that the Rangers could be going after, so should be a little bit shorter than this 35-ish minute podcast. But thank you all so much for making Locked On Rangers your first listen every single day. For your next listen, check out Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day, available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Thank you all so much for listening and subscribing, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.